My name is Camille Foster. When the doctors finally turned off the machines, the room fell into a hush so dense it pressed against my ribs. My parents lay side by side, hands barely touching, as though they were still holding each other up. I wanted to curl beside them, but grief kept me upright and moving. Someone had to phone the funeral home, choose the music, sign the paperwork. That someone was me. I wrote their obituary on the back of a grocery receipt while the coffee in the hospital cafeteria cooled into tar. I handled each chore with mechanical grace. Convinced momentum would smother heartbreak, duties arrived in waves that refused to stop breaking. I organized the service, sorted through closets, and sold the car to cover unexpected debts. Each task felt like a small betrayal, as though efficiency proved I loved them less. Paige wept beside the caskets, mascara slick on her cheeks, and clung to me afterward, murmuring that she didn't understand how I could stay strong. I almost told her strength was simply the only coat left on the hook and I was still freezing. Inside it, instead, I smoothed her hair and swallowed my own shiver. At night, I sat on the floor of my empty apartment, sorting bank statements into piles nobody saw, teaching myself how to breathe through the ache. The estate lawyer called every morning, another document to notarize, another deadline to meet. I handled each request with a practiced calm, because falling apart seemed indulgent when bills still needed paying. Grief had a rhythm, and I became its metronome, steady, precise, unspoken. I believed order would save us. I thought love meant absorbing every blow without complaint. I never imagined the price Paige would soon demand for it. Paige's first phone call after the funeral sounded brittle, as if every syllable might snap. She apologized for disturbing me, then admitted she was cornered by something urgent she refused to name over the line. I imagined medical papers, maybe a looming eviction. Sympathy eclipsed my caution. She whispered that only a temporary loan could keep her afloat until her next paycheck, promising to repay me within the month. I logged into my online banking while pretending to weigh the decision. Truthfully, love had already pressed my finger toward the transfer key. I asked how much would solve the crisis, hoping for a modest figure. When she breathed the amount, my stomach lurched. The number equaled my entire retirement account, the fund I had built by packing leftovers for lunch and skipping vacations. For a breath, I thought about saying no, but Paige's silence on the other end felt like a hand slipping from a ledge. I typed the transfer, hit confirm, and told her we'd figure the rest out together. She exhaled a sob of relief, calling me the best sister anyone could ask for, vowing to wire the money back as soon as she could breathe again. After the call, the apartment seemed to widen with emptiness. I brewed tea I didn't drink and watched the kettle grow cold, staring at the void on my bank statement. I tried to anchor myself in the belief that family eclipses money, that generosity circles back like migrating birds. I reminded myself that Paige had always been impulsive but never malicious. To quiet my rising dread, I repeated aloud the lullaby our mother sang whenever storms rattled the windows. Soft night will cradle the morning bright. The words felt thin, but they were all I had left to hold. I folded the receipt, praying my sacrifice would not become regret tomorrow. Days bled into weeks, and Paige's promised repayment date slipped past without a word. I told myself she was drowning in whatever emergency had panicked her, so I left voicemails full of gentle reminders and sisterly concern. Each unanswered call sounded louder in my ear, but denial wrapped itself around me like a quilt, threadbare, yet comforting. Then, during a restless scroll through social media at 2 a.m, her smiling face flashed across my screen. She was perched on the deck of a catamaran somewhere off Santorini, sunlight sparking on a glass of champagne. I stared at the image until my eyes watered, convinced I had stumbled onto a stranger who merely resembled her. But the next photo laughed. No doubt, Paige in a bright silk dress I recognized from a boutique she once called ludicrously out of my budget, standing before a waterfall in Iceland. The caption read, "Chasing magic wherever it falls." My thumb shook as I clicked her story highlights room. Mykonos, Dubrovnik, each city, a bead on the necklace of my vanished savings. Shock arrived first, sudden and electric. Anger followed like an aftershock, threatening to crack whatever composure grief had left intact. Yet the emotion that settled deepest was humiliation. I pictured every overtime shift at the clinic. Every night I canceled dinner plans to save $30 and felt as though a spotlight was exposing my gullibility to the world. I wanted to call her out publicly, to demand my money back beneath her filtered sunsets, but my fingers froze. Instead, I closed the app and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, letting betrayal seep through my veins. I did not scream. I simply began to plan. Vengeance, I discovered, is not born in fury's blaze but in the patient embers where pain cools into certainty and resolve, unyielding steel. Betrayal breeds silence, and in that hush, I found unexpected focus. Instead of phoning Paige with demands she would surely dodge, I opened a fresh notebook and listed every asset our parents had left: the lake house, the modest investment portfolio, the antique piano no one had tuned since high school. Seeing the inventory on paper steadied my pulse. Each item represented a memory, but also a choice. If Paige could treat my trust like an ATM, I could treat sentimentality like a luxury I no longer afforded. I scheduled an appointment with our family lawyer, Mr. Ortiz, a gentleman whose eyes held both warmth and razor edges. He remembered drafting my parents' original will, remembered Paige's gleeful declaration that the lake house would be hers one day. When I asked about making revisions, he studied my face before sliding a stack of forms across the polished oak. His only question, "Are you sure?" I answered with the calm of someone who has stopped bleeding. Over the next week, I gathered deeds and bank statements the way other people gather seashells. Between shifts at the clinic, I met with appraisers, confirmed account numbers, and signed my name until the ink threatened to run dry. With every signature, I felt a thread loosen from the net Paige had cast around my life. In private moments, I worried that vengeance made me cruel, yet I could not ignore how right my spine felt. Finally uncurling. On a gray Wednesday morning, the final document slid through the fax. Paige's name vanished from our parents' legacy, as cleanly as if it had never existed. I closed the folder and exhaled, realizing the air smelled less like spite and more like oxygen. Freedom, it turned out, had paperwork. I tucked the folder away, promising myself that justice needed no applause, only completion at last. The lake house waited like a forgotten chapter, its cedar boards weathered but unbowed. I arrived at dawn, keys cold in my hand, and stood on the porch listening to loons call across the water. Their lonely notes echoed the hollow inside me, yet also hinted at possibility. Morning light spilled through tall pines, dusting the roof with gold that no bank statement could diminish. Inside, sun-bleached sheets still covered the furniture, shrouds for a past that needed breathing room. I peeled them away one by one, coaxing motes of dust into the air like tiny ghosts. The piano sat in the corner, ivory chipped, silent since our mother's last lullaby. I pressed a key. The note wavered but held. So did I. Settling in was less a renovation than a conversation with spaces I thought I knew. I patched a leak in the roof with instructions from a bookmarked video, sanded the porch rail until splinters stopped biting my palms, and discovered a stash of childhood drawings tucked behind a loose stair. They were of stick-figure sisters holding hands beneath a smiling sun. I stared at the tiny crayon hearts over our heads and felt grief and anger wrestle for the right to speak. At night, waves lapped the shore in slow applause, affirming each small victory: a working faucet, a repainted window frame, the first meal cooked on the stove that once simmered every holiday stew. Without meaning to, I began sleeping through the night again. Dreams returned, not of revenge but of color: turquoise water, red canoes, yellow daffodils. By day I budgeted carefully, mapping out a lean future on scraps of envelope backs, discovering how little I needed beyond this quiet, steadfast place. For the first time since the hospital, I breathed without counting the cost. Peace, I realized, can be as deliberate as survival itself. Paige breezed back into town on a warm Friday afternoon, rolling a designer suitcase over the cracked sidewalk, like it belonged on a runway. Her skin glowed with Mediterranean sun, and her hair was lighter, salted by oceans I had only seen on screens. I watched from the lake house window as her rideshare pulled away. Dust swirling around her heels, she paused, scanning the property, confusion knitting her brows when she noticed the fresh paint on the porch and the new lock on the door. I opened the screen quietly, greeting her with a level tone that surprised us both. Paige hugged me as though nothing had shifted, commenting on how cute the renovations looked, oblivious to the legal tectonics beneath her feet. Inside, she bounced from room to room cataloging plans, spa days, shopping trips, parties to throw once she moved. Improperly, I listened, sipping tea that had long gone cold, allowing her monologue to spin like a kite with no string. The envelope arrived 2 hours later, hand-delivered by Ortiz's assistant. Paige accepted it with a carefree smile, certain it contained some welcome-home paperwork. As she read, her grin withered. Lines of text etched the truth into her perfect tongue. She no longer owned a single splinter of this house or any other family asset. Her voice cracked on my name, both accusation and plea. I answered with the fax date's signatures, balances spoken softly yet immovable. Shock flickered into anger, anger into disbelief. She argued timing, questioned legality, invoked parental wishes. I met each volley with calm, reminding her of the trust she had shattered, the retirement fund she had drained. When words failed her, silence settled like dusk. For the first time, Paige saw that consequences do not negotiate. She turned away, toward the lake, and the ripples reflected a future suddenly stripped of its entitlement. In the days that followed, the lake house felt like a stage set for a play with only 2 stubborn actors. Paige moved through the rooms restlessly, slamming drawers she no longer had a right to fill, while I repaired screens and cataloged pantry staples, as though organization could buffer the tension. Arguments ignited over the smallest sparks. Who left a window open, whose turn to buy groceries. Yet beneath every complaint lay the same unspoken wound pulsing between us. One evening, a summer storm gathered, and thunder finally gave our anger a voice. Paige cornered me in the kitchen, rain clattering on the tin roof. She demanded explanations for my betrayal. Wielding guilt the way some people wield knives, insisting our parents never would have approved. I countered with bank statements and timestamps, each fact stripping away her last illusion of innocence. Her eyes filled, not with remorse but with fear and emotion she had spent her life outsourcing to me. For the first time, I refused to catch it. I told her I loved her but would no longer subsidize the reckless chapters she kept writing. My voice trembled, yet it stayed steady enough to outline boundaries. No more loans, no more entitlement, no more safety net. I promised I would help her find work, budget, even heal if she showed evidence of genuine change. Otherwise, the door would remain closed. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the kitchen in a single stark flash. Paige's shoulders sagged, the bravado leaking out of her like rain through a broken gutter. She gathered her suitcase in silence and walked into the storm, pride holding the umbrella I would not extend. My tears came only after the engine of her cab faded down the gravel drive, mingling with the thunder's retreat. In the hush that followed, I felt grief loosen its grip at last. Slowly, rumors travel faster in small towns than mail, and within weeks, Paige's freefall became common knowledge. I heard she rented a room over the old hardware store, trading Instagram sunsets for buzzing neon, and a mattress that sagged in the middle. Friends who once tagged along on her yacht selfies turned scarce when champagne bottles disappeared. The cafe hired her for weekend shifts. The gossip pages noted the irony of a world traveler wiping crumbs from booths. I caught glimpses of her, sometimes, shoulders hunched, designer shoes swapped for sneakers scuffed beyond repair. She avoided my eyes, and I respected the boundary of her chosen distance. Pain, I had learned, needs privacy to ripen into lesson. Still, I mailed her a budget worksheet, an apology for earlier harshness, and a list of counseling centers that offered sliding scale fees. She never responded, but I noticed she stopped wearing the most expensive jewelry. Perhaps she pawned it, or perhaps reality finally outweighed adornment. While she wrestled with consequence, I settled deeper into the rhythms of the lake. Mornings began with a paddleboard glide through mist, lungs drinking air untouched by exhaust. Afternoons I volunteered at the community clinic, teaching seniors to manage their medications, rediscovering purpose beyond survival. Evenings belonged to the piano. I hired a tuner, and the instrument's voice returned, tentative yet clear, echoing across the water like a promise. Sometimes regret whispered, could I have saved her another way? But memory answered with images of yachts and champagne. Compassion does not cancel accountability, and love without limits is merely self-harm in disguise. So I prayed for her quietly, and stewarded my own healing aloud. Both endeavors, I discovered, demanded equal measures of patience and grace. Each sunrise affirmed that resilience is less an act of triumph than the humble, daily choice to keep turning toward the light within me. Autumn painted the shoreline with bronze and scarlet, and the lake house settled into its most honest season. With repairs nearly finished, I invited neighbors for cider by the fire pit. amazed at how readily warmth circulates when walls finally come down. They complimented the polished floors and freshly strung fairy lights. Unaware they were also admiring the framework of my reclaimed self. I enrolled in a part-time financial counseling course, determined to share hard-won wisdom with others who might trade tomorrow's security for today's desperation. On weekends I sold handmade candles at the farmer's market, each scent named after a chapter of renewal: Second Chance Cedar, Boundaries Birch, Quiet Victory Vanilla. Strangers bought them for the fragrance, but I watched their faces soften, as though the labels spoke truths they too needed. One evening, I found the courage to open my parents' old journals, stored in a cedar chest under the stairs. Their entries were mundane garden notes, grocery lists, inside jokes, yet every page glowed with an intimacy I had once overlooked. They wrote often of wanting their daughters to find contentment, not grandeur. I pressed those words against my heart like a bomb, realizing I was, at last, living the smallest version of their dream, with the greatest measure of peace. When the first frost cloaked the dock, I hosted a modest recital, inviting clinic patients and market friends to hear the piano sing again. The notes were imperfect, but the applause felt larger than any stage. I dedicated the final piece to resilience. No one clapped harder than the old sailor who once taught me to skip stones. In that echo of gratitude, I understood rebuilding is not about restoring what was lost, but about crafting what was missing all along. And for the first time, my reflection in the window looked capable of protecting and forgiving simultaneously. Winter laid a soft hush over the lake, and the house exhaled warm cedar into crisp air each time I opened the door. Standing on the porch, I watched snow gather on the branches like pages still blank, waiting. Reflection came easier in the stillness. Memories settled gently, instead of striking like hail. I rehearsed the story of the past year, testing its edges, until pain dulled to shape rather than stab. Trust, I realized, is neither infinite nor expendable. It is tender currency minted in moments and spent in choices, and once squandered it returns only through laborious coinage. I had given mine freely, perhaps recklessly, and the loss carved hollows I had to fill with steadier things: boundaries, self-respect, a knowledge of my own worth. Sometimes people ask if I regret cutting Paige from the inheritance. Regret is a word with slippery walls, but I answer honestly, I regret that my love could not save her from herself. I do not regret saving myself from the fallout. In letters, we now exchange, cautious but cordial. She tells me she is learning to budget, to apologize, to live without an audience. Time will decide what those words become, and I am content to let it judge. As for me, I plant spring bulbs along the porch, trusting they will bloom even if another frost whispers threat. Protecting myself no longer feels like building barricades. It feels like tending a garden that welcomes, yet refuses to be trampled. Mom would call that growth, Dad would call it getting on with it. I call it standing a quiet, everyday victory that costs nothing, yet means everything. When I finally close my eyes each night, I thank the dark for teaching me its secret. Even the deepest shadow is just a place where light gathers its strength before rising again for another dawn.